Let's talk about broken authentication, which is second in the list for the OWASP top 10. Now, if you want to go to this page, I will link it down in the references, or you could just go to Google and say OWASP broken authentication, and it should be the first one that pops up. So when we talk about broken authentication, there's a lot of different attacks here. And if we look at is the application vulnerable, I kind of just want to talk through this, and some of these are going to be very familiar to you. So when we talk about authentication, we're talking about how can we get access to this application, right? And how can we authenticate to the device? Now, there's a bunch of different options here. If we go down the list, now it says, does it permit attacks such as credential stuffing? So can we just supply a valid list of usernames and passwords and gain access? You've seen that in the past. And when you're talking against a web application, that's considered broken authentication. Does it allow brute force attacks? So there should be some sort of rate limiting that's happening. If we are giving a brute force attack to a website, if we're conducting a brute force attack and we are able to submit hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of requests, then that's an issue, right? And that is going to cause a situation where we are able to log in with an account given enough time. Another thing is it says, does it permit default weak or well-known passwords? Well, admin is such a real thing. If you encounter a website and you find a login portal, you should be looking for something like admin, or you should be looking for default credentials if it's something that is a well-known service. Something like, for example, Apache Tomcat, which you saw in an earlier video where we logged in with default credentials. In the next video, we're going to talk about the next one, which is using weak or ineffective credential recovery or forgot password processes. And this is where if you have the forgot password process, you go there and maybe something like on the screen is the question for the user or the question that they're going to ask. And we see this a lot, and it's just bad practice because that might be guessable. Like, what street did you grow up on? Well, there's only so many streets that we can pick out there. Or if we do a little bit of research on this person, guess what? We can probably figure out where they grew up, what street they grew up on, and narrow it down. So this is just repetition here on a lot of this stuff. Skipping down a bit, does the website have multi-factor authentication? Meaning, if we do credential stuffing and we do log in as the user, is it going to block us once we log in with multi-factor and say, hey, we need something else from you? Or is it just going to let us in? And other things it's asking about, does it expose session IDs in the URL? So sometimes your session ID or your cookie is going to be in your URL, which is not good. It's not best practice. And will it rotate your session ID? So what happens is when you log in, you should get a session ID and it should rotate. Some websites, when you go to the website, it gives you a session ID and then you log in and then it rotates, you log out and it rotates. Some other websites, you log in and the session ID stays the same, and you log out and the session ID stays the same. That is what's called session fixation, and that could get really dangerous as well. And so just looking over these, it's all dealing with authentication issues, and it's a big bucket of things that it could fall into. And for this one, we're not going to talk prevention in a separate video. We're just going to talk prevention kind of as we go and through this. But you should be checking your website. You should have multi-factor authentication, right? You shouldn't be using weak credentials. You should be rotating your session IDs. A lot of this is kind of like common sense, but it's overthought or overlooked, I should say, when developing applications. So these are just easy wins for us. You should have a rate limiting when you're doing brute force attacks, or you should have like a CAPTCHA on there or something that will prevent me from attacking your website or your login over and over and over. You should not be allowing weak credentials. You should be doing checks for those. You should have, just preventative measures in place for all of these sorts of attacks. And for reference, this is great down here. Again, the cheat sheets on different things and different types of attacks in here. Session fixation, you can see is actually in my history because I navigate to this quite a bit. This is one that we find quite a lot, and we'll cover this when we get to the reporting section. So keep that in mind. Again, I'll have a great example of session fixation for you in the reporting section. So from here, we're going to go into a how-to video, and we're just going to talk about testing for it and looking for broken authentication. And I'm going to talk about some minor findings that we might encounter as well, and how we're going to look for those, and just how we would test for this more so than how or the vulnerabilities that are there. And I'll explain that in the next video why we're doing that. So I'll catch you over in the next video when we start testing for broken authentication.